The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development warns that growth is slowing in all regions of the world, hamstrung in part by austerity measures that are hampering demand in the major developed country markets, thus cutting the export prospects of developing countries. Joining us on the desk is the group's economist, Alex Izurita. Thank you so much for your time. Alex, is it all bad news? Because we're hoping that you've got something good in store for us.
Well, I do have hopes as well, but in order to bring this hope forward into reality, I think we have to rethink a bit about how policies are being implemented. And our main message tonight, after we issue this report, which is a kind of long-term analysis of developments, it's not as short-term as the news that we just heard. In our analysis, we noticed that there is a slowing down of aggregate demand for the world as a whole. And this slowing down, which comes from the recession and the post-recession, is telling us that the recovery is not strong enough. And the fact that this recovery is not strong enough has to do with various reasons, and one of the most important reasons is the inability of households to push the economy forward by increasing demand. And this inability, therefore, has to do with basically how households are perceiving their incomes. And we know from the long term that in many important economies of the world, the demand has been complemented, the demand from households has been sufficiently strong by complementing the sources of income from wage earners, for example, by an excess of credit that brought us to the crisis.
Kevin and Mohammed have done their research. They've both read your report. I believe you spent all afternoon looking at the 280-page report.
208 pages.
They've got a lot of questions for you. Gentlemen?
Alex, in the report, you focus a lot on the fact that fiscal austerity has really hurt the global economy, and it's pushed the economies weaker, and you would argue that certainly about Europe, and you can actually start to argue that about the US. And therefore, you would argue that you actually need a little bit more stimulus. You need government to be more involved, and I would agree with that. But how would you go about dealing with the high government debt? Because obviously, if you do more fiscal stimulus, you're running the risk of just exacerbating the debt situation around the world. How would you try and marry those two arguments?
Yes. Well, that's a very critical question. I'm glad that you raised that question because it gives us opportunity to explain this to our audience. The very problem of the global economy at this moment is that there is not sufficient aggregate demand. And therefore, because there is not sufficient aggregate demand, there is a slowing down pattern of consumption and investment as well. So if I were an entrepreneur, I would look at what are the expectations of my sales in order to invest. And the expectations of sales are not so positive. Now, so if in addition you refrain the other source of aggregate demand, which could be public sector spending, then actually that is going to create more unemployment, and it's going to create more burden for the public sector as well to pay for unemployment and to cover for all the social spillovers into social tension and etc. So then in reality, by slowing down on fiscal spending, we are aggravating the problem of financial stability of the public sector, because in reality the public sector needs to grow its sources of revenues by having a more dynamic global economy. And that's what the problem is. Everybody believes that by cutting spending we are going to resolve the problem.
But would you therefore endorse that, let's say in the US, that their debt to GDP ratio, government debt to GDP ratio, which I think sits at 105%, would you endorse that going higher, 110%, 115%, in order to get growth going? So would you be saying, let's live with the higher debt till we get the growth going?
As a matter of fact, the debt of the United States has been far higher during and after the Second War, and they recover from higher than 100% debt to GDP ratios to lower than 40% by growing. It was the fastest growing period of the US economy that allowed to get rid of the problem of debt. Apart from that, the 105% of debt to GDP ratio in the United States has mostly to do with internal debt, which is debt between the Federal Reserve and the government. So there, in reality, the debt of the United States is not so high. And our position is that there is no way to get off the problem of debt unless that the economies start to
Mohammed, you want to jump in here?
I think something that's a burning issue for me is that we've almost disproportionately focused on monetary stimulus in terms of our reaction to this global crisis. Not enough emphasis has been placed on the fiscal stimulus. That's really the camp that you're coming from, saying austerity is not necessarily going to solve this problem. But when you're looking at the mix of that spend in terms of that fiscal stimulus, and let's maybe bring this to a country like South Africa, where we've got a very large social grant component of the spend and maybe a smaller component in terms of investment in fixed capital and capacity building. How would you propose nations across the world address that balance? Because naturally, if you pull back on the social spend, that becomes socially destabilizing. We've got lots of poor people, but if you don't invest enough in terms of the investment, in terms of the capacity building, that's bad for longer term growth. How do you propose nations balance those two factors?
Well, that's equally a very important issue. In reality, what happens is that we promote the idea of social spending and also the idea of contributions of the government in order to protect wage entitlements and the like, because we are convinced by several studies over decades, not only our recent study, we are convinced that it is the lower income sectors of the society that they spend all of their income. The higher income sectors of the society, they mostly save and invest in financial instruments that produce nothing for the economy, for the real economy. So on the one hand, there is this aspect that focusing on social spending, on transfers to the poor. The South African government, for example, has a very interesting pension program, has a very interesting housing program, has also a number of other social transfers in its budget, which are helping the poor, who in turn spend all of their income. And that's very important, particularly when the aggregate demand is slowing down. That in addition to that, and you are absolutely right on that, there has to be a contribution of the government to the long term. And this contribution is precisely what triggers private sector investment, because when the governments invest in infrastructure, they are paving the roads, literally, for the private activity to take place.
I'm going to pit economist against economist here. Mr. Lings, do you buy into the thesis that Alex is putting on the table?
Yeah, I do actually.
You're supposed to be pitted against him.
I know, but I do.
Not concur.
And it's got to do with this notion that if you wake up in the morning and you think that you are highly indebted as an individual in your home, then your natural reaction is to cut back your spending, which is fair. But in doing that, you make the assumption that your income remains unchanged, and therefore all you've got to do is cut back your spending to match your income. If you try and do that at a macroeconomic level, it never works, because when you cut back your spending, you're cutting back somebody else's income.
Paradox.
And as a result, everybody's incomes fall, and you just go into a downward spiral, and that's what Europe's done. So in a bizarre way, when Europe wakes up, or the US wakes up with so much debt, to get out of the problem, they've got to get more indebted. And that sounds just counterintuitive. It sounds like it won't work, but it's the only way out.
Mohammed, your voice to this discussion?
I think, theoretically, it's a very well-known fact. It's a paradox of thrift, and if everyone saves at the same time, it's going to contract. So I think, in terms of spreading that out, in terms of the lower income earners, maybe bring that Gini coefficient more in line with what's palatable. That certainly may give a nice stimulus through to the underlying economy. That being said, the deleveraging effect that we're experiencing now becomes a psychological effect. And that can tend to become almost a generational aspect. And you're seeing that in the US. Unless they get that housing market to turn around and convince consumers that wealth effect from houses are going to make them wealthier and that they should spend more, you're not going to get this to turn in a short time frame. And that's what's concerning me.
What I'd like to have seen in this global debate, and I don't know if Alex can comment on it, is that instead of this out-and-out desire to effect fiscal austerity, look at the UK, introduce massive fiscal austerity, is to say, for governments to say, let's reprioritize spending, and let's look at where the areas that we're spending on that don't really help in terms of growth, and let's dispense with that, and let's channel that money into areas that really do encourage growth in the private sector. So it's not necessarily that I'm saying governments must go out and now spend even more, but they must be careful about what they're spending their money on.
Absolutely right. I'm actually impressed of the quality of economies that you have here in South Africa, and I would wish.
Well done, Kevin Lings.
I would wish they would be in front of the larger economies of the world, because I think that the problems of the world economy will be more easily resolved. I completely agree, and I would actually complement with what you said in terms of selecting the sources, the avenues for spending, as much as that also in selection the sources of income revenues. Because I think that for the governments as well, in order to promote growth, they must realize of the very important fact that it is the lower sectors, the lower income sectors of the society, the ones who would spend all of their income. And in that sense, that is yet an additional reason to strive for a progressive income, a progressive taxation from the part of the government.
Alex, a point you touched on in your report, and I'd like to unpack this a little bit more, is when you look at the labor market, look at labor market rigidities. This is quite a contentious issue in South Africa. We're considered to have a very rigid labor market, and as a result, that's seen as an impediment and a constraint on economic growth and the flexibility.
And it makes us
in the
highly
economy.
uncompetitive.
Yep.
Your comments on that, and structurally, how do you change that? What's the ideal model in terms of your thesis?
Well, the thesis is based, the kind of general opinion about this is based on the view that the wages are too high, and therefore entrepreneurs do not employ because labor costs are too high. But lower labor costs, then you will make yourself more competitive. But what happens is that, again, that is the single view of an entrepreneur, fair enough. But if all entrepreneurs look at that in exactly that way, what happens is that wages will be down for the economy as a whole and for the world as a whole. That means that the capacity of the people of my country to consume and also to import what other countries are able to export to us is getting lower and lower and lower. And that is what we call it in our report, a race to the bottom. And then by promoting this race to the bottom, we are not helping anyone. So therefore, we should really be careful at making sure that wages grow at the same rate of productivity growth and the inflation rate. No more, but no less.
But on that point, when you're looking at productivity, you're looking at South Africa there as a measure of how productive are we for every rand spent.
Yeah.
We're an outlier. We're not very productive, but the wages tend to be higher than, for example, if you look at other nations, if you look at nations in Asia, I'm not going to say China specifically, their productivity per dollar spent is a lot higher.
Well, there are two things there. The comparison of relative wages between one country and the other implies that one country can be too high or the other country can be too low. And indeed, one of the problems of the world economy of the past 2 or 3 decades is that we have been pressing through this race to the bottom for outsourcing, for example, or the fear of outsourcing to lower the incomes of the workers, and therefore to lower the incomes of the workers of the entire world economy. So that's one aspect of what you said. The other aspect, which is equally important, is that it is very difficult for an entrepreneur to assess the productivity growth that it is fair for the economy as a whole. Because how do you value, for example, the productivity of a nurse in a hospital? How do you value the productivity of the teacher? And therefore there has to be certain protections of wages for the economy as a whole, which tells about what effectively they are doing for the people of their own country. And that is a concept that is very difficult to put forward in macroeconomic terms. So therefore, the best you can do is to allow for a general level of standards of living consistent with what the country is producing.